according to my, you're changing in the middle of the sentence and saying, according to my own understanding, which ought not to be done. Therefore, I can draw a conclusion out of that. It's hard for us to engage in that because we've already laid out the rules that this is the foundation of what we call evil and good. It's based on scripture and the nature of God. And if we don't stick to that and find it to the end, then there's
Oh,
no
I am
way to
sticking to
actually
that.
say that we're being inconsistent, because we will be inconsistent if I follow your own logic, basically, to redefine evil based on your standard, which is just personal to you, it's arbitrary as far as I'm concerned, because it's not
No,
exactly
I
what
use
everybody
both
else has.
standards.
Do you understand what I'm saying, though?
I understand that.
Okay,
But
great.
I'm using a conception of evil that's pretty standard, I think, right? It's just that which ought not to be done, and
Yeah,
that
but
which ought not
standard
to be
based
done
on what?
is
Because
God's official. Yeah, yeah, I'm explaining, right? What ought not to be done is God's discretive will, what God's ultimate plan is. That's what ought to be done, and anything that goes against God's ultimate plan ought not be done. And under that conception, if you think God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good, there can't be any evil.
we've already said this a lot. I mean, I know we're going to keep going over and over because people come into the room, and I understand that. I told you I'm not trying to
No, no, I've been
say
listening for
that.
a long time.
Okay, so here's the thing. God has his ultimate reasons for everything, but he still permits good and evil within that context. Now, the initial stage was because
Wait,
there's
can
an
I stop
ultimate
you for a
good.
second? Just to clarify.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to
No, it's
clarify
fine.
just
Yeah, so I don't have
to
to go on
try
and
and
on
save
about
time.
something.
Yeah, yeah. Are you thinking of evil as that which goes against God's ultimate plan?
I'm thinking of evil as that which is contrary to God's holy nature. Yes.
Uh,
See,
wait,
maybe I want to contest that part because I don't know. There's something fishy about what you're saying there, Billy. Um, you know, because I want to say that in God, God has a plan that does contain evil events that do occur, right?
Exactly.
So I think
sorry,
what you're trying to do
but
is you're trying to define God's entire plan, every event in it as well as what ought to have happened. And I don't think I want to do that. I think that's
That's what we've
possibly
been
wrong.
trying
I
to
think
tell
but
Billy
I
and
think
so many other people. When you
but I
say
think that that's
all, listen to this, Billy. We said that all things work together for good according to the counsel of his will, right?
exactly
Okay,
yes.
good. Now think about this. All things, what are the all things? Those all things are not necessarily good, even though it brings about things that will be for good ultimately. So you have to deal with the fact that we are saying that there's good, there's evil, but in all of that, in spite of all of that, God is not restrained by the evils of his own creation or his creatures, not to come to his ultimate glory, which is his good, which is a good. So what ultimately trying to read it backwards to mean that all like Matt said clearly, it says by saying God is good does not necessarily mean that every action and every creature under him is also good. We're trying to that's where we're equivocating basically and making good one size fits all in all the meanings. That's not what it is. You
But
have to accept the fact that script there's a definition for evil, and evil occurs, and we see evil occur. For you to deny the reality of evil goes into absurdity. That's what I've been
well,
saying from the start.
no, but I think it's what follows if you believe that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. I don't think that allows for the existence of evil in the ultimate sense.
Sorry, I
Like,
didn't
I'll
get
give
the
you an
last part. What
example,
what did you
right?
say just now? All what?
Sorry. If you believe in a triomni God, right, a God which is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good,
He's
right,
also all
and
righteous, all just,
yeah,
and a
that's fine.
consuming
That
fire.
those,
Okay, so we have
I
to not take one
but
aspect of him and make it the entire whole of who he is. He is a God who also hates evil himself,
that's
and he
fine.
will punish all evil. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, right. And we conceptualize good as that which ought to be done, and evil as that which ought not to be done. And what it means for an agent to be good
Sorry, when you say
is
ought
that
not
they
to be,
always
based on what?
choose
What's the
God's
standard?
ultimate plan. Yeah, God's ultimate plan.
Yes, I understand what you're saying in God's. What do you mean by ought not to be done? Because
If
God
God has
allows
a
things that
plan,
ought not to be done ultimately to work for the good that he has to do. So we have to define the different stages of ought not. There's an ultimate good that cannot be thwarted by anything that we do. That is God's decretive will from all eternity.
Yeah,
He knows
that's
the
what I'm
end
talking
from the
about. That's the
beginning.
standard. Yeah, that's
No,
the
that's
standard I'm
that's
talking about.
one level of it, yes. But then
Yeah, that's
he
the only
works.
level I want to talk about, though.
Okay, here's the thing. By saying that doesn't mean that every other thing under it does not is not defined as evil in and of themselves.
That's fine. But I'm just
Okay,
talking about the ultimate evil, right? So I'll give you an example, right? You might think that stabbing a baby with a needle is evil, right? In it that it ought not to be done. Except if the reason I'm stabbing a baby with a needle is to give the baby a vaccine to prevent the baby um, from catching a disease which will kill it slowly over 10 days. Well, then all of a sudden it doesn't become what ought not to be done because it's allowing some greater good, right? So you might think in a vacuum, stabbing a baby is evil, right? That it ought not to be done, right? But if you conceptualize then stabbing a baby to give it a vaccine to prevent it from suffering and dying over 10 days, all of a sudden it then becomes it becomes good. It becomes what ought to be done, right? So if you mean evil, just like, oh, okay, when I don't know, when George Floyd was murdered, that was evil, right? In the sense that if that happened in isolation, it would be what ought not to be done. But if that murder, and just to be clear, I think that was evil. I don't think that it does lead to a greater good. But if you say that, no, the reason God allowed that is because it led to some greater good, then all of a sudden it becomes what ought to be done. And what follows from that, if you're saying that good is, that God works evil in accordance with his ultimate plan, then everything just becomes good and there is no evil.
again, very false equivocation right there. Very false equivocation. The point is, if a guy is trying to stab a child and he happens not to be a doctor and he stabs that child, it is evil. Maybe he's putting them with something he claims to be a vaccine. That's why he was stabbing that child with that needle. But ultimately, it didn't work out. The child ended up dying from the effect of that particular vaccine. I'm just using your analogy so that to be clear. It dies from the effect of it. That thing was not good in and of itself. Now, the thing is, the difference is because God knows the end from the beginning. When He permits His actions, which are evil, while they're being done by those. A typical example is, for instance, when the brothers of Joseph sold him to Egypt, they were doing an evil act by selling him to Egypt. But when Joseph confronted them, he laid it out clearly. He said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." There's a clear difference between primary and secondary actions in this thing. One is clearly evil, while the other one utilizes it for the good. But that doesn't negate the fact that they're evil in and of themselves, because those people, by their own volition, have now incurred a wrath of God that justifies their own punishment if ultimately God doesn't forgive them for that. So I don't want you to take away from the
Exactly.
responsibility of man and God's sovereignty. What you're doing is trying to play God and understand where God comes from, which you do not have. The only thing we have is the revealed will of God. And when He tells you something is evil, it is evil. Ultimately, you're trying to find out why God would do something. That's putting God under judgment. In other words, you put Him under your own authority to define whether He is doing good or evil. We become the judge and not Him.
I'm also reminded
That's
of the
fine.
passage where it says, "Should we go on sinning so that grace may abound? God forbid," right? So there's a prescription for man, and to go against that prescription is evil. Yet just because God is preordaining it at the same time, I don't see the problem. I mean, I get
So
why a person might
well,
find a problem initially, but
look,
Exactly.
I don't think we even disagree, right? I'm just
Then where's the
conceptualizing
disagreement?
evil
Sorry,
as
Billy.
that which
Billy, here's what I want to understand, because we're going in circles right now. I
I'm
actually feel
saying.
like I'm going in circles
No,
because
no, no, no,
I
no.
don't get what
But
your
well,
argument is.
let me just
Okay.
clarify. Well, let me just
Yeah.
clarify.
Give
So
me your
what
own
I'm saying,
argument.
yeah. So what I'm saying is that if you conceptualize evil in accordance with God's ultimate plan, right, and everything goes along with God's ultimate plan, right? As you gave the example of Joseph selling what his brothers into slavery, was it, or something like that?
His brother selling him to slavery. Yes.
Oh, his brother selling him. Yeah, yeah, right. And you say that's evil in the sense that his brother did something evil in some sort of lower order sense, right? But I'm saying that if you then say that God meant it for good, then that action becomes good in accordance with God's standards. So when Joseph's brother sold him into slavery, it becomes good because it's what ought to have done. It's what ought to have happened because God meant it for good, right? And so
Yeah,
there is
I,
no
No,
evil
no,
if you conceptualize
you're
it in that
conflating
sense.
two issues right now. You have to deal with this equivocation thing, fallacy right now. You're
I'm
basically
trying to.
no, here's the thing, you're conflating two different things. God meant it for good doesn't mean that it wasn't evil in its actions. The actions were
What do you mean
evil.
by evil?
They were evil because they were contrary to God's nature. You don't sell people. God has already decreed that. You don't sell people, especially your own brother, into slavery. That's definitely an
yeah,
evil act. Anybody would affirm that.
yeah, I think
Go ahead, go ahead,
I
Vince.
think it's the same mistake
But I
from
think
earlier.
that
I think there's like, I think it's now shrouded in like several different issues. For one, I think you don't distinguish between creaturely causation and, uh, let's say, creator causation, which I think are different. I think there's an assumption that whatever ought to happen is whatever God's planned to happen, which I would say is not the case, obviously, because God planned a lot of evil events to occur. And and if I were to accept kind of like the view you're imposing on me, like, would you say like, so God decreed? I said this to someone in a message, but God decreed rocks to roll down hills. Are you saying like rocks have moral obligations then on this view to roll down hills?
if, well, again, if it ought be the case that
That's a yes or
rocks
no
roll
question.
down.
Isn't it?
Sorry?
Yeah. Did you say yes or no to that question?
Well, it just depends if rocks, I mean, if it's in accordance with God's plan and you define everything in accordance with God's plan as what ought to be done, then yeah, it's what ought to be done.
Well,
Rocks
yeah, I
rolling
think we
down the hill
shouldn't
is what
do
ought to be
that.
done.
Yeah, so I don't
But
affirm
then what
that
do you
kind of
mean by
view.
good?
Yeah,
Like,
I
if you
think
don't
that.
understand good as in a normative sense, as oughts and ought nots, then I just don't understand what you mean.
No,
Well, I
no,
mean, I don't
no.
know if this helps at all. Ty was talking about a couple weeks ago and was saying, well, that's the problem of definition. Evil is not what ought not to be done. That's like a little bit ambiguous, way of putting it. So he said rather that
I,
it is sinning against God. That's evil. I don't know if
ought
that
you sin
helps the
against God?
conversation. Huh?
Ought you not sin against God, though?
Correct.
Yes, you're not supposed to
Yeah,
sin
so,
against God. If you sin against God, it's evil. And guess what happens to that evil person? If he dies in his sin, he goes to hell. There's
wait,
a
but
punishment for it. There's a
that's
punishment
fine.
for
Look,
it. There's an eternal punishment for it. The point is that when God punishes those things, it's because it's evil. So and God did not let anyone off the hook. Basically, all sin must be punished and it must be accounted for, and that's what Jesus came to do with those who he that are saved. So when we kind of lay it out and say, oh, it's God, that he just leaves it an arbitrary definition of evil, like what ought not to be, ought what to be done in what sense? Define the
I
ought.
understand.
Define
Yeah,
ought.
yeah, but look, yeah, I defined it many times.
No, you
What ought
didn't.
not
You
to be
didn't give us
done.
standards for it.
I
It's
did.
not a preference. Give us this.
I did.
What is your
No, I did.
ultimate standard for defining an ought?
The idea, right, under the Christian conception is, thank you.
Sorry, Billy. I need to stop you here. So
So,
let me be clear on something. We gave you a Christian perspective, which did not define it as ought not to be. You brought that definition. Now, the question is, you prefer that definition because that's what you said it makes sense to you. So, I want you to define what you mean by ought without calling Christians because they
yeah,
definitely do not hold that view as you do.
but
So,
it's a,
don't say
but it's,
Christian because if you go to Christian, we'll go to biblical definitions, which negates exactly what you're saying. So, it's not a
but
different.
look,
So, people will listen and think it's a Christian viewpoint. It isn't. Go ahead.
well, I think it is, and I'll explain why, right? So, if you define evil as that which goes against God's ultimate plan or is against God's nature, right? Then I'm just going to ask, ought you obey God's nature? And if the answer is yes, and those are analytically identical, then it just follows, unless you deny the law of transitivity, that good is what ought to be done, and good is in accordance with God's nature. Those are analytically identical.
Okay, so here's where the problem
Yeah,
is. The problem is that when God, we separate it into decretive will and what? Okay, so prescriptive will. We have the
I'm
prescriptive will where
talking
he
about
says,
God's decretive will,
listen first.
the
There's
ultimate
what?
standard, right?
Yeah, okay. So here's the thing. When his decretive will can never be thwarted by anybody. It's not possible. He decrees it and he brings it to pass. It's that which he does. His actions he takes in time, regardless of any creature's any input. The point is that he does it and it happens. That one cannot be thwarted. There's never been uh, stopped by anybody. We're talking about the prescriptive will, whereby he defines morals, where he tells us, "Thou shalt not kill," or thou shalt not murder. Sorry, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet. Those are different from his total decretive will, which will come to pass regardless of whatever we do. That is not in question. The question is the moral part of it, where we even have an input. We have the volition to actually do it or not do it. That's a different thing entirely. You're bringing two different things, aspects of it. When God created the world, you couldn't stop him from creating the world. When he caused the wind or the tornadoes or to happen or whatever it is, you couldn't stop it on your own. If he causes the rain to fall and the sun to shine, you couldn't stop that. The point is, we have to go to the ones that are not possible, that God does, which are prescriptive, but we see every day being violated by people, and there's a punishment for that as well. So we have to separate those two things, because you don't understand what you mean when you're saying decretive will and prescriptive will. Sorry, Vincent, to cut you short, but you needed to speak out.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe just to spitball ideas off of you, Billy. It seems to me like there's more presumption in your view from your statements than argument, to be honest with you. So, like, for one, we start with like a rigid distinction between analytic truth and synthetic. But I think you're a little smarter than you're putting off here. I think you recognize that, like someone like myself might even doubt that distinction. There's been people like Quine and stuff that have, and to that extent, take that for what you will. Secondly, I think there's also kind of like an issue. There's an assumption of like, when I say good in reference to God and good in reference to creatures, that like I assume that those things are the same. I actually don't. I hold to a very rigid view of the creator-creature distinction. So I think when we speak of goodness in terms of God, we're talking about some kind of good in between, amongst the Trinitarian persons. Let's say a loving, self-giving to one another. That is not identical at all with like humans. We don't actually have that at all. But we have something, let's say, like created tropes to follow after that. And to that extent, I think there just is a big presumption, assuming that there is no creator-creature distinction in your view. Go ahead.
So, yeah, okay. So look, if I understand evil in the Christian conception as that which goes against God's discretive will, and as Namdi, sorry, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that's a good pronunciation actually. You got it right.
Namdi?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. As Namdi said, that there's nothing that can go against God's discretive will.
No,
And I define evil as
decretive
that
will. His will.
decretive will,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay. Good. That's all.
Decretive will, sorry. And
Yeah.
there's nothing that can go against God's decretive will, then it just follows analytically that nothing's evil. Right? There is no evil. Under that definition, and if you'd say no, that's not what I mean by evil, then we're just equivocating on evil.
All right, so I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to put this whole thing to rest because I've been busy for a little while, but I understand the argument. I really do. So here's my question, though, okay? Because the argument is basically this: premise one.
You're a bit soft, Ty.
Like, go
understand
closer
me?
to the mic. A little bit faint, but if you can correct it. If not, then we can still hear you. Just
I'm on full volume and you're
Is
still a
that-
bit faint.
Is that any better?
Not really. But it's okay. I can
It's
hear
kind of
you
faint.
well now.
Yeah, it's kind of faint. Yes.
All right, hang on one second.
Billy, if you mute, it'll help.
If what?
Everybody else who's not
Okay, how's
talking
that?
but Ty, mute, please.
Is that any better?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
much better.
Okay. I had to fix my mic. So here's basically the argument, and you can reword this however you want to, but premise one is evil is that which should not happen, right? Premise two, if an action has a greater purpose, it should occur. Premise three, God has a greater purpose for all that occurs, and the conclusion is everything that God decrees not only will happen, but should happen, therefore evil does not exist. Now, Billy, is that correct? Am I stating the argument correctly before I respond to this?
Yeah, that's pretty much. Yeah, I mean, if I looked it out, I might change a little bit, but that's good enough, I think.
Okay. So here's the question, all right? In premise one, is the proposition equivalent in meaning to sin against God will not happen, or is the proposition of one equivalent in meaning to sin against God should not happen?
Sorry. If sin against God, me,
All right, so evil,
if sin,
when we talk about evil, okay, and you guys are
well,
asking according to the Christian position, all right, evil is that which is sin against God. That's what
then we're
evil
just
is.
equivocating. Yeah, but
No,
obviously people sin
no.
against God, right? But presumably, that when, for example, the Holocaust happened, right? That was a sin against God, as God said, "Do not murder," right? And killing 6 million Jews, I take it as murder, right? But often an answer to the question, well, why does God allow that? Is, well, God meant it for good. God had a greater purpose. But then by that definition, okay, if you define evil as sinning against God, then yes, there's evil, right? I don't have a problem with that. But if you define evil as that which ought not occur in accordance with God's ultimate plan, then the Holocaust would be part of God's ultimate plan. He would have a reason as to why it occurs, and therefore it's good.
No, you don't understand what I'm saying. Okay.
But then
Premise
we're just
one
equivocating on
is
evil
that
then.
are you asking us to answer to the Christian position or someone else's position?
To the Christian position,
Okay.
Christian
So
position.
the Christian position is defined in the Bible, okay, as far as evil goes. Evil is that which is sin against God. That's what evil is. All right. When evil happens, that is sin against God. Right? So the premise one, all right, is the proposition of it equivalent to meaning sin against God will not happen or sin against God should not happen.
Well, if you define evil as sinning against God, then my argument just doesn't go through because I have a different conception of what evil is. I mean, presumably.
Yeah, that's right. And see, that's the problem. You're asking us to answer according to what your position of evil is, and you're not asking us to answer according to what the Christian position of evil is. So when you ask us to answer, you're asking us to answer according to your position and not our position. Do you understand that, right?
I understand. But I think
Okay.
that.
So why should
I'm
we
saying
answer
is
according
that,
to your position?
because I think I'm correct in that everything that happens is in accordance with God's ultimate plan. And if you define evil, remember.
No. You're not answering my question. Why should we answer according to your position and not ours?
You don't have to. Look, you don't have to. But look, remember what I said at the
Then why are you
at the
asking
start.
us? Why are you talking to us? Why do you want to know what our position is if we're not going to answer according to our position of what evil
No,
is?
because I think
You're
no,
ask,
because
you need to
I
go
think
ask
if I'm
someone
allowed to
else.
explain, I think if I'm allowed to explain, I think you'll actually agree with me. So look, remember what I said at the very start? And I gave the example of if a Christian just defines evil as my left arm, but then they say, oh, but that left arm is in accordance with God's greater plan for me to have a good workout, and therefore the existence of evil is compatible with the existence of God. That's fine, but I have a different understanding of what evil means, and I mean evil is an normative notion, meaning that that which ought not occur in accordance with God's ultimate plan. Nothing can prevent God's ultimate plan from occurring, right? And everything that happens, if in its accordance with God's ultimate plan, then it's good, right? It's what ought to happen in accordance with God's ultimate plan. And then you say, oh,
Billy,
but sinning against God
I'm going to
is...
give you one
Just
more
one
chance
sec.
to
Just
tell
one
me
second.
why.
Wait.
No, I'm going to give you one more chance to tell me why we should answer according to what your position of evil is and not ours. We're only going to answer according to what the Christian position is because we're Christians. And asking us to answer according to another position is just absurd and ludicrous.
That...
So
Can
why
I
should
have
we
an input,
answer?
please? Wait, 1 second. Can I have an
Okay.
input, please, time? Yeah,
um
so is
because
sin is something that you should not do?
Evil is that which is sin against God.
Yeah, and I'm asking if sin against God is that which you ought not to do.
That's correct. Evil is that which
So you
man
are
should
not
not do.
so you are not disagreeing with Billy.
exactly.
Now go ahead.
Before,
Billy,
before,
I didn't know.
Sorry,
I
sorry,
don't know
hang on,
what you do
sorry,
inside.
RODI.
sorry, Rudy. We have to have one mic in this conversation. We will get back to you on that, but let Billy flesh out so that he can land and we can move on to you or the people who have come into the room before you. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to go soon anyway, but
No
I did have
problem.
a shower and do work. But yeah, so the idea, right, is that if we're talking about so I'll try and answer your question as directly as I can. Like, your question was, why should we what was it? Why should we answer to
No,
my standard rather than the Christian perspective? And I'm saying no, you shouldn't, right? I'm trying to do an internal critique. So if I misrepresent you, you can stop me, and I'll try and steelman you as much as possible, right? But I'm saying that from a bird's eye perspective, i.e., God's perspective, He has something, He has this plan, right, for humanity, for the universe, right? And every single piece of it is in accordance with God's plan, right? As Matt, I think Matt Slick said earlier, or someone else said earlier. Oh, it might have been Namdi said that when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, right? In the sense that this action happening, whilst it was a sin against God, right? And so you might say, okay, well, that's an instance of evil, but it's compatible with the existence of God because it served God's greater plan. Well, what I mean by evil, right, and is just that which goes against God's ultimate plan. But the Joseph's brothers selling into slavery was going in accordance with God's ultimate plan because God meant it for good by the own passage, right? And so it does nothing to dent my argument by you saying that, well, what we mean by evil is sinning against God, right? Because then we're just equivocating on evil. And I agree, there's no problem if you define evil as that sinning against God. In the same way, if you define evil as my left arm, there's no problem. But then we're just equivocating.
Okay, good.
Right?
So back to premise one then. Okay. Is the meaning of premise one that sin against God should not occur at all ever, or is the meaning of premise one that sin against God should not morally happen from men? What's the meaning?
Every time someone sins against God, in meaning that they do something out of accord with what God's nature is, like they do something unloving or something like that.
So
Every
it's
time someone
it's
does
the
that,
second one in. So sin against God
no, no,
should
no, no,
not
no.
morally happen from men. That's what you're saying? That's what the premise one means?
No, I'm saying that it ought occur. If it is following God's ultimate plan, then every time someone sins against God, it ought occur, because it's leading to some greater good, as premise 2 said, right? It ought occur.
No, because that's
God meant it for good,
so
right?
the meaning
God meant it for good.
All right, Billy, listen. I'm not trying to be a jackass, for real. But
No, that's fine.
it's either meant to be that sin against God should not occur at all at any point in time, or it's meant to be sin against God should not morally happen from men, right? It's one of those two. Now, if you don't understand the difference from those two, then I'll explain it. One is saying that one should not ever occur in the future because God is not going to allow it to take place. And the other one is, like we've been saying, a prescriptive, a command. Sin against God should not happen from men. So which one is it?
Okay, sorry, I'm just a bit, okay, so the first option was, sinning. Obviously, it's not the first one, because the first one was sinning is, God will never allow people to sin. Obviously, that's not true, because under your conception, people do sin, right? So it's not the
No,
first one.
but see, I'm asking according to this argument. The premise one is that evil is that which should not happen, right? I'm asking, what is
God's ultimate plan?
Okay, so it's not referring to evil should not happen in the sense that men should not commit evil. That's not what that premise means?
Well, I'm saying that men can't commit evil, because everything they do will be in accordance with God's ultimate plan. Evil can't exist if an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God exists. I'm saying that
Billy,
everything is good in accordance with God's ultimate plan.
I understand that. What I'm asking is that this proposition of premise one, evil is that which should not happen. That is meant to be understood. The meaning, okay, evil is that which should not happen according to God's ultimate plan. That's what it's in reference to?
Yeah.
Okay. So, where's the problem then?
Well, there's no problem, right? It just follows that nothing goes against God's ultimate plan, and so nothing is evil if you conceptualize evil as that which goes against God's ultimate plan.
No, that's not how it works, man. I don't understand why we have to keep going around in circles with this. I mean, this is like so obvious at this point. We've gone around and around and around.
Wait, but what's the rebuttal?
Exactly.
The rebuttal has been going on for 3 hours, Billy. For 3 hours. I don't understand why you guys don't get this. I really don't.
In fact, the first premise, evil is that which would be a nonsensical first premise, because you are basically naming something that doesn't exist.
Exactly, right? Evil doesn't exist.
No, but
There's
you started with the premise that
plan.
evil is defined. Why would you use evil, which doesn't exist, and define it, and then say it doesn't exist? It's ridiculous.
What, unicorns are mythical?
Billy, listen, Billy, you understand this, okay? Billy, you understand this, okay? If God allows something to happen, if he allows a man to sin against him, okay? Because all sin is sin against God. That's in Scripture. If God allows sin against him to take place, that does not mean that God caused the sin to happen. You understand that, right? You understand we're saying that from a Christian perspective.
That. Can I ask a question, though?
Okay.
Wait, can I ask a clarifying question?
Hang on. That does not mean that sin should not happen because God should not let sin happen. Right?
But so this is the clarifying question I needed to ask. When men sin against God, is it building towards God's ultimate plan or not?
Since he allows it to take place, absolutely. Right? And he
Right.
has
So it's not evil.
So he has the right to allow sin to take place. He has the right to allow evil to take place. And I gave this analogy earlier. Okay. Let's say that you were my neighbor, Billy. Okay. And I told you, Billy, don't murder me. Please don't murder me. And you said, okay. And I came home one day and you were standing behind my front door in my house waiting for me to stab me with a butcher knife as soon as I walk through the door. All right? I know that you're there. I know what your intentions are. Do I have the right to walk through my own front door and let you kill me or attempt to kill me? Do I have the right to do that?
Hey, Billy.
Do you have the right to allow...
Hang on, don't interrupt while I'm asking him this question, Dex.
Sure.
Do you have the right to allow me to kill you?
Do I have the right to walk through my front door regardless if you try to kill me or not?
Under my conception of rights, then yeah.
Okay.
I don't understand how that's relevant to the argument that I'm making.
Because just because I didn't try to stop you or prevent you from doing it and allowed you to commit this evil is in the same way God has allowed men to sin against him. Okay? He does this as a judgment against men. He allows men to sin against him, and judgment's just one of the reasons why. So there are many reasons why God allows men to sin. All right?
Right.
But that does not mean that God is the cause of it. It doesn't mean that evil doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that evil doesn't take place and that sin against God does not take place just because he allows it to take place. So the notion is absolutely absurd. It doesn't make any sense.
Hey, Billy.
I agree, but if it's building towards God's ultimate plan, if God has a reason for allowing people to sin, right, as Namdi said, right, that when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, God meant it for good, right? It is in accordance with God's ultimate plan. God had a reason for allowing that to happen. Therefore, it ought to happen in accordance with God's ultimate plan. So everything is good.
It's not about it ought to. It's going to. Okay. It's not a matter of ought to, like in the sense of man ought not to, as a command. Like you shouldn't do this in the future. It's not even used in the same way. When you say it ought to occur, that wouldn't represent the Christian position. It's going to occur. If God predetermines something to happen, it will occur. It's not a matter of it ought to occur. It's going to occur.
Wait,
it's not even a matter of.
Wait, but ought it not occur?
Ought is an implication to morality, not
exactly.
Whether
We're
or not,
talking about morality, though.
No, you're talking about God's plan. You're talking about what God has determined to take place.
Is God's plan good? Ought God's plan happen? Ought God's plan come to fulfillment?
God's plan will come to fulfillment.
But is it good that God's
plan
comes to fulfillment?
Does come to fulfillment.
But is it good that happens?
Of course it's good, yeah.
Right, so it ought to occur if we understand good as a normative notion.
No, you're saying that you're applying language to it that doesn't befit it.
Wait,
but again, this is going back to the separation of categories, right? Good in one sense, but not in another.
But we've gone right back to the start where we're not conceiving good as a normative notion. Therefore, I don't.
No, you're not listening to Ty. Ty is saying clearly something that is very there. His decretive will is not up for grabs. It's not something that you contest. That will happen. It's not an ought to happen. It's not like something that is may or may not happen. No, that's what will happen. It will. Basically, we're just waiting for it to happen if it hasn't occurred yet. So there's a difference
What
between
God's
that and
plan
what
not
is
happen?
what is prescriptive in its own plan. So the point is that can you stop God's plan from happening? No, it's not up to you. So it's not an ought to. It will happen.
Well, it's up to God, right?
Okay.
He has free
Well,
will.
But when
I'm
you
gonna have to
question
go now
when you
because I do
question
have
that,
like.
Billy, you're basically saying that you put God under judgment of your own authority, and that's not possible.
No, not quite. But look, I gotta go now, so I'll just wrap it up.
All
I'll
right,
have a final
thanks,
say
Billy.
if you let me.
You've been a sport. I
Yeah,
have
no
to
worries.
I have to admit, in this sense, you've been great in terms of being cordial in your responses and everything else. And I pray that you actually look at these things from a scriptural perspective and see that we're giving
Yeah.
you Christian answers. That one at best. The fact that we don't fall behind the authority of where you stand has to be clear in this distinction what we're trying to make between us and you.
Yeah.
I hope you understand that.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, and I appreciate the conversation. I think you've all been nice to me, and I appreciate the honesty. But yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, I was gonna have a final say, but I think I've made my point. So I'll just bow out. But thanks, guys. Thanks for the convo. Take care.
Thanks, Billy.